Hello everyone, this is Mitch and welcome to the fourth episode of my Kerbal Space Program Capsules. So today we're going to tackle the question that is probably bugging a lot of new players, and that is how to get into orbit. So there are really three, you know, major ways of getting into orbit. The first is spaceplanes. It's arguably the most efficient and rewarding way to get something into orbit, but it's also arguably the slowest and the most complicated way to do it. The reason is you are taking advantage of the atmosphere on Kerbin to use air-breathing engines, so you don't have to carry the oxidizer in your fuel tanks. And those engines are very, very efficient. And you're also exploiting the fact that there is an atmosphere, and using lift, you can, avoid fighting against gravity as much by using the aerodynamics to your advantage. However, once you're in space, those air-breathing engines, they're essentially useless unless you're just returning the vehicle right away and, separating something from your plane that is going to then leave into space without those air-breathing engines. But, eh. And not to mention that you have to, when developing a space plane, you have to take into account drag and all kinds of things that you don't need to take into account, well, that are less important with a rocket. It's very easy to make a plane that is unstable or that has too much drag or that gets exponentially bigger because you're trying to carry a lot of stuff into space. At the other end of the spectrum, we have rockets that go up vertically, almost straight up, out of the atmosphere, and then go sideways, and then turn to their side and accelerate to reach orbit before falling down. Doing this is not the most efficient. I believe this rocket should be able to do it, so I'm going to demonstrate it quickly. But it's not the most efficient. However, if you have a very unstable rocket that tends to break apart or spin around or whatever, then it's maybe a good idea to try this approach. So we're going to actually use physics warp here because honestly we're just going straight up out of the atmosphere and then turning to our side to reach orbit. The vehicle is not perfectly stable, so I'm actually going to tilt it, pitch it back on center. If you had a very wobbly vehicle, unstable or whatever, this is potentially something you want to do. Otherwise, I'm going to do the same thing with the same vehicle, and you're going to see we're going to reach orbit by using a lot less fuel. So I'm going to hide a flight engineer here. We don't care. We have the fuel readings here. Going up, going up, going up, and we're just gonna keep going like this until we are out of the atmosphere, or at least heading out of the atmosphere reasonably high so that we have enough time to reach orbit. Now, you want to point east when you're trying to reach orbit because the planet is rotating, because the planet is rotating from east to west. And that actually adds up to your orbital speed once you take off. So it's actually easier to get into orbit if you are going east rather than west. And similarly, for a polar orbit, it's a bit more expensive in terms of fuel to get there like that. So right now, we are going to 90, 100, and so on kilometers apoapsis. We are out of the thick part of the atmosphere, so you could turn your rocket like this, completely horizontal. There we go. And now apoapsis is not raising as fast. Time to apoapsis is actually going lower and lower. But we have wasted a lot of fuel to get up there without building horizontal speed, because ultimately you cannot get into orbit by going purely vertical. The best you can do by going purely vertical is actually escaping the sphere of influence of Kerbin or whatever body you are lifting off from. You're not going to get into orbit. You're just not. So we're burning sideways, burning sideways. Periapsis height is going up very slowly. We have almost burnt all the fuel in these two tanks, and we had the side liquid fuel boosters that were actually feeding these two engines as well. So really, really not the most efficient thing to do. Hopefully we're still going up, and we have one more stage we can light that is probably going to manage to send us into orbit, although it's... you know, you could get into orbit without even using this stage. So let's just see how much fuel this consumes. It's obviously very stable, but it's very, very fuel intensive. So, okay, we are getting into orbit here. Only a few more hundreds. Delta V acceleration. Periapsis. And off. Periapsis is above 70 kilometers. So, doing this, we have a very eccentric orbit, but we are in orbit indeed. And we burned almost half of the fuel in the upper stage. I mean, if we look at Kerbal Engineer, this can still go places, but it's very, you know, let's just test. Okay, revert flight, revert to launch. So the second way we can get into orbit using a rocket is by performing a gravity turn. So there are various degrees of aggressiveness, if I can say so, for gravity turns. I'm going to go with a very aggressive one because I know this vehicle can handle it. But essentially, there are a few key points to remember. First of all, this rocket can handle it, but some rockets going out of the prograde marker during ascent is a death sentence, or at least making sure that you will actually start tumbling, and whatever, you're going to be wasting a lot of fuel if that happens. So I'm just moving the attitude of the spaceship, pitching, or in this case yawing, off the target a little bit, off the center, and then I'm slowly tapping the controls, and you know, I'm just slowly going up and turning the rocket sideways. I don't want to do this too fast because then I'm just going to curve back down into the sea, into Kerbin. But you can be relatively aggressive with it because once you're out of the thicker part of the atmosphere, even if you're not leaving the atmosphere for a while, you can actually burn horizontally a fair amount, and you know, your apoapsis will keep rising. You will just not exit the atmosphere as fast, but that's not a big problem. So we are reaching 20 kilometers. We are getting into a thinner part of the atmosphere. We are staging as well. And, you know, this is going really well. And we still have 2 fuel tanks that are completely full, thanks to fuel ducts. And we are just going to keep leaning the rocket sideways. We gotta watch the apoapsis here. We don't need to go really much above 70 kilometers. And we'll just keep turning like this. So at this point we're getting a little bit of heating effects, if you can see. But the atmosphere is so thin here that we are not really wasting much fuel. And since we are burning sideways so much, this is very efficient because it's only, the moment you are out of the atmosphere, the only thing that counts for an orbit is your horizontal speed. So here I am almost completely horizontal. My apoapsis is still going up. It's actually going further away in time as well. So I can just point myself like this. Now we are way past another checkpoint, and that checkpoint is 30 kilometers. At 30 kilometers, the atmosphere is thin enough that you can actually, and now I'm just going to turn the engine off because I'm so far away from the apoapsis, it's just not efficient. Um, yeah, so sorry. The, what was I saying? Anyways, doesn't matter. So the other checkpoint is roughly 30 kilometers. At 30 kilometers, the atmosphere is so thin that you can actually turn your rocket sideways by a fair bit and still not lose control, even with an unstable rocket. You can probably start doing it at 20 kilometers with a semi-stable rocket, however you feel it. But with a stable rocket, you can actually be pretty aggressive, and it's going to be so much more efficient. Like right now, we still have about, a quarter or a fifth of the fuel from these two tanks, and we're getting really close to an orbit here. And we are out of the atmosphere in a few seconds. There we go. I'm just going to keep burning. I don't care. At this point, this is not the most efficient thing. You want to wait until apoapsis, really. But at this point, it's just a proof of concept. So apoapsis rising, 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 rising. Periapsis is also rising. Okay, so I've wasted fuel here, but hey, doesn't really matter. So as you can see, we haven't even touched the fuel in the other stage. We just didn't. And we can get into a similarly high orbit, actually. We're not quite as high, I think, but we are fairly high. Now, we're not actually quite in orbit yet. This is going to get fixed in a second. There we go. It's not a circular orbit, but hey, we have 80 units of liquid fuel left, and we are in orbit with the same vehicle, just by using a more efficient trajectory. So let me just revert one last time and show you how I usually do it with heavier rockets that tend to be a little bit more unstable, but still stable enough that I can actually turn, and that is this. Full throttle SAS, go up a little bit, can actually accelerate time a little bit here again. I usually go up to about at least 1 kilometer, maybe even higher, and then I just pitch a little bit. And I just keep tapping the D key slowly, and I'm waiting for the program marker to catch up here. Now, this might not be the best example because this rocket is just, it's really great with the amount of gimbaling and stability. But even with a heavier rocket that tends to bend a little bit or whatever, that has a lot of drag at the top, this is pretty safe. So keep going up, and I'm going to keep turning very slowly, very slowly. I'm going to make sure that I'm staying inside the prograde marker as much as possible, not caring too much about the altimeter, the altitude, and I'm only going to care once I passed 25, 30 kilometers, then I'm going to look at my apoapsis and, decide whether or not I need to pitch more, to yaw more, to be more horizontal, or to point more upwards. So in this case, apoapsis is perfectly fine. I've got 1 minute 20 to apoapsis. I can actually just turn like this. It's not going to be as efficient as the previous maneuver, at least it shouldn't be, but this is a good way to get into orbit without using as much fuel as just going straight up and then turning the rocket, because you're honestly just wasting a lot of fuel if you're doing that. It's a lot safer, but this method should be plenty safe, and we should reach orbit in just a couple of minutes. I'm going to accelerate again. So controls are super sensitive because I put the physics warp. So what you can do to compensate is press caps lock, and you'll see my controls have turned blue, and this is precision mode. Now, of course, in ×2 it's still twice as fast, twice as responsive, but same idea works. So turning off the engines here, you can see already that I have a bit less fuel than previously. And now I'm not going to do the same inefficient maneuver that I did earlier, but I'm still going to get into orbit without using as much fuel, without using the top stage fuel, and that is doing so. So I've waited until apoapsis. This is better. The only thing you need to watch out for if you're going to cut your engines during ascent before reaching orbit is waiting too much and then not having the time to actually turn your engines back on and reach orbit before you fall back down into the atmosphere. So there we go. Achieved orbit. And actually, I think I have roughly the same amount of fuel. 37 times 2, 74 units of liquid fuel. So less efficient, especially considering I'm in a lower orbit. But I still made orbit, and this time you can try it, even with a big rocket. This should be fairly safe. Between 20 to 30 kilometer mark being the safe mark to turn your rocket fully sideways, and just taking a gentle curve before that. And the key thing to remember is keep your vehicle in the prograde marker as long as you're under 30 kilometers. You don't want to leave that marker because aerodynamics will spin your rocket or whatever, or worse, it can break it apart. I'm sure you've all experimented that. Alright, so if that helped you, or if you enjoyed watching, please leave a like and subscribe. Comments and feedback in the sections below. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.